Hello and welcome back to Premier Injuries, and we are once again talking on a Thursday to Tristan Thomas all about tactics. Yes, it is your Tactic Thursday, but before we get into this week's discussions, remember to like, share and subscribe to the Premier Injuries channel. We've got so much to talk about, so much to do, and today we're talking about the ill-fated Sheffield United. I mean, starting comments here. I'm a little bit upset. You know, I had a soft spot for them. I used to have my paid up membership of the Chris Wilder fan club, but the dream is over, Tristan. I mean, starting comments from you. Are you a big fan of what the Blades have done and accomplished coming up to the Premier League, or were you a little bit more sceptical of the ways of Wilder?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose if you were like a fully paid member of the Wilder club, I was kind of maybe here and there. I'd dip in for a week or so, have maybe a bit of a free trial, but I wasn't fully kind of involved in the Wilder hysteria. Tactically, I respected his team a lot, and something I guess we're going to talk about is the 3-5-2 and the overlapping centre backs that were so good in the Championship in particular, and how in the Championship they played very good football. High possession style of play, which changed slightly and adapted slightly in the Premier League, but still kind of stuck to their principles. So I had massive respect for him due to that. As a kind of character, as a coach, he seems very galvanising and very someone you'd like to work for in his previous clubs and at Sheffield United as well. But I think at times like, his personality seems a bit maybe strange or difficult to get along with or something like that. But I think if you remember last season when they were doing well, lots of his interviews, he was very, even if they won a game or performed well even, he was like digging someone out or being like, we need to be better in this, we need to be better in this. Like bearing in mind they were overachieving massively for the quality of the players, as we'll speak about, and also the size of the club, etc. So I found him a bit strange, like the way he'd go off in press interviews about certain things, and maybe just no, I don't know, the type of personality that not every kind of character would get along with. I mean, in his history, there's some players that didn't work well under him, some talented players, some players like I don't know, Calvert-Lewin. Also, the lad who's at Bournemouth now, his name completely escapes me, who he let go and is doing very, very well. So, he's kind of a strange character, but one that obviously was very, very successful with all his clubs and Sheffield United up until this season.
And you mentioned it there, the tactics of the team delivered them to a fantastic season. They finished ninth last season, only 5 points off the European places. And it was this weird, strange, unique tactics that the team have deployed. So once again, you put together a lovely little video for us, Tristan. So just talk us through initially what the tactics of Sheffield United were/are. I don't know if they'll continue that under the new kind of boss and regime going forward, but they were a very special style of playing in the Premier League.
Yeah, so one of the main things I kind of understood from Wilder interviews, obviously being a Sheffield United fan himself, I think he was critical of the football in the Football League in the kind of recent past of a lot of teams playing with one striker. So I think a main kind of part of his and Alan Neil, his assistant's philosophy, was to have two strikers on the pitch. So this wasn't in a traditional 4-4-2. They opted instead with Sheffield United with a 3-5-2. I'm not entirely sure if it was from the outset with Sheffield United or whether he kind of adopted it after maybe a few months in League One or the Championship. But yeah, this was the setup that they had last season anyway, and the season before. And you can see here it's a 3-5-2. Firstly, Henderson was in goal last season. Yeah, the back three of O'Connell, Egan and Basham, probably the most regular starting back three for them last season. Norwood, Fleck and Lundstrom were fantastic three in midfield, who were their kind of three players they played the most often in midfield last year. Ender Stevens, left wing back, Baldock, right wing back, and then forwards, either McGoldrick or here I've got Musette and McBurney as their two forwards. So specifically with the overlapping centre-back strategy that was kind of so infamous in the end and so kind of well documented and spoken about. The main kind of benefits of this is that it allows them to basically create an overload on one side and then create crossing opportunities from that. So with the two strikers, the main kind of outlet for them in terms of creating chances and building play was through crossing. So you'd have Chris Basham on the right side and O'Connell on the left side, overlapping or even underlapping, which would obviously kind of disrupt the opposition defence, like a normal overlap or underlap. You know, if you're a left back up against the opposition's right winger, and then the fullback traditionally would come bombing on, either around or inside, then it gives the fullback a 2v1, a decision. So this obviously created space for crosses and, you know, created spaces in the opposition's kind of defensive shape. And then also allows them to create width, which is so important to create chances, have people, you know, on both flanks that can pull the opposition's defensive block laterally and create spaces between players. And so, yeah, this kind of overload with Norwood would then kind of drop back and protect, so then it wouldn't be too vulnerable on the counter-attack. So it's very, very valuable for them in attack, but it was also quite valuable for them defensively as well and in transition for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you can see on the video, actually, if we stop it at the right point, that Ender Stevens, the left wing back, if the ball's on the right side, he would be not extremely out on the left with chalk on his boots, so to speak. The centre backs, obviously, are the guys that are providing the width in the team. So if you have Stevens out as far as he can go on the left and the ball's on the right, if you lose possession somewhere in the centre, for example, then you're vulnerable to the counter-attack. Whereas having Stevens more centrally allowed them to kind of pass back from the right side, and then O'Connell would bomb down on the left, so they still have the width. However, if they lost the ball, they still have Stevens there centrally or O'Connell there centrally. They lost the ball kind of earlier in the move before he'd gone and actually bombed on. So it allowed them to have width, but also to have defensive solidity. And obviously, if you build your attacks down the flanks mostly, and you're not constantly rotating and switching and circulating the ball. If you just play down one flank, try and get an overload with an overlap, and then you do lose the ball, then it allows you to counter-press much more effectively. And also it pins back the opposition winger. So I think they had a positive result against Manchester United earlier in the season. And then after lockdown, they really struggled against United in one game. But the Rashford, for example, who was playing out on the left in that game, I think was really restricted in his position because he was having to track Chris Basham. And when United won the ball, Rashford was then 90 yards away from the goal. So, it's for a number of reasons, both in terms of attack and in terms of defence and stopping counter-attacks. It was a highly successful strategy, very kind of innovative, and has been copied in a few places in teams around Europe. But something that worked very, very well for them up until this season.
And this is the story, you know, looking at last season, the team were fourth best defensively for goals conceded. We do talk about the system a little bit later. We're going to talk about maybe how it might have cost the team this season as well, the inflexibility of it. But one of the focus points, building from the back as you will, I want to talk about the quality of goalkeepers. I think that is one of the main big regressions we've seen this season. Henderson, you'd say on the level of maybe being a near world-class or world-class shot stopper. He was ridiculously good last season. Whereas Ramsdale, who they did spend big on, according to Transfermarkt, 18.45 million, which is not a little fee for a goalkeeper, there's been a huge downturn. So looking at the data that's coming up on screen, last season Henderson had the second best XG prevented with 8.3 goals, a great save percentage, fifth best in the Premier League, and in terms of the actual team, they had the fifth best clean sheet percentage ratio of 34.2% and goals conceded per game of 1.03. So fantastic stuff. Exactly what you've described there. They kind of kept the chances limited. Then you look at Ramsdale and the goalkeeping this season has just not met those levels. He's got the third worst XG prevented of -6 goals let in. Save percentage is only 4% difference, but that has seen it go down to 14th in the Premier League. And then they've got the third worst goals conceded per game and the rock bottom worst clean sheet percentage ratio. And what's interesting to me is that is 11% off the next worst team in West Bromwich Albion. I mean, is that overplaying from my perspective here of how important Henderson was to that defence, or was he really that good?
I think, first of all, in general last season, they massively, quite largely overperformed their expected goals for and against in terms of chances. So I think pre-COVID, they were sixth in the table. However, in the kind of expected table, based on the chances for and against, they were 11th. So again, a slight overperformance there. And this season, obviously, underperforming. Like they've got very few points in the league now, maybe 11 points, something like that in the league. And they should have around 10 more points than that. So yeah, massive underperformance. So although it's a very stark contrast in terms of their league position right now, it's kind of maybe more of a natural drop-off from a team from one season to the next. And that kind of, the goalkeeper situation is a part of that as well. Like they're not conceding much worse chances or many more chances. However, the chance they are conceding, they're letting in more because of the keeper situation. And Ramsdale's not an awful goalkeeper. There's a metric that we can use, and the ones you mentioned as well, but post-shot expected goals, where we measure the quality of the shot, or you kind of what part of the goal it's in, and how often those kind of shots are expected to be saved. And Ramsdale was around average for the league. However, Henderson was just so much better than I think any other goalkeeper in the league last season. He was like in the top 2 or 3 keepers in every single goalkeeping metric, and is a fantastic goalkeeper. And I'm sure we'll see that in the future at Manchester United if this contract situation isn't resolved. So yeah, I think they had a very, very top goalkeeper last season and a pretty average one this season who hasn't really performed to his biggest strength. And Henderson is also a keeper that made some very good contributions and saves in like 1v1 situations. And Sheffield United, with their high line, were kind of vulnerable to counter-attacks last season. Conceded, I've got here, I think 8.9 expected goals up until lockdown from counter-attacks. And more this season for kind of some reasons I might go into. In terms of their structure in possession. But Ramsdale for Bournemouth wasn't a goalkeeper that was kind of behind the high line a lot of the time, isn't a goalkeeper I'd associate with being like a sweeper keeper who's quick off his line and making good decisions in 1v1s. So yeah, different kind of type of character and goalkeeper as well.
So you've mentioned there, the way that the Sheffield United team play defensively as well. And examining their defensive data, there's been a huge downturn there as well. Now, we will talk about the injury of Jack O'Connell, and also that there has just been a litany of injuries throughout the whole of the team, and this has disrupted their style of play. And this is reflected in the data as well. So goals conceded per 90 last season, as we said, 4th best. Now it's down to 1.72 per 90, 18th in the Premier League. The XG conceded per 90 was 9th best in the Premier League, now down to 19th. Shots in the box conceded 7th to 17th, and big chances conceded per 90 gone from 11th to 20th. Clean sheet percentage, as we talked there with the goalkeepers, from 5th to 20th. So is part of the reason this injury to Jack O'Connell, what is maybe other reasons? Have they been found out and not been able to tactically adapt to teams countering their counters?
Yeah, so obviously it's a great point with the injuries they've had, not just at the back. Obviously, they've had O'Connell out, as you mentioned, and they've had to pay Jagielka a lot, who, just clearly isn't up to standards for the Premier League in 2021. And then in the midfield as well, they had Fleck, Norwood and Lundstrom last season. Very, very robust midfield. Lundstrom, formerly a defender. Players that can, win challenges, counter-press very effectively, win tackles and duels. And then where they've not had that, they've had Ampadu playing a lot this season, either in a holding role or even as a centre-back. And he's just a lot more lightweight defensively, a young player, pretty good on the ball, but not someone who you'd put in the same bracket as the other guys in terms of the ability to recover the ball and read the game. So tactically as well, I think teams have figured them out. It's part of the reason they're not scoring or creating as many chances is because last season they were very kind of heavy on the crossing attack. I think I may potentially have some stats, but they were like their XG from crosses was much higher last season. Last season than it is this season. And also teams are just kind of now inviting them to cross, as you can see here on the graphic. They're inviting them to cross. They're compacting the centre. They're defending the area inside the box very, very well. I remember it was their first game of this season. I think they played Wolves, and they were very poor in the first half. But then they kind of dominated possession in the second half. But they just couldn't create anything or clear-cut chances because Wolves are so good defending compactly. And Wolves kind of gave a blueprint for every other team or every other kind of team outside the big 6 or 8 to play against them, which was just to stop neutralise the two central forwards by just piling numbers into the box and kind of inviting them to cross. I know their crossing numbers have dropped off slightly in terms of the amount of crosses they're making this season. But like Basham, for example, his expected goals this season and crosses per game, also expected assists and crosses per game has dropped massively. And then they've not had Ender Stevens on the left side, left wing back, and as mentioned, O'Connell left centre back overlapping. So their crossing attack has been a lot worse, and then also it leaves them vulnerable to counter-attacks because if you have your centre back overlapping and the opposition are inviting the cross, then it allows the opposition an opportunity to counter-attack from. And like I said, where they've not had the kind of quality or rigidity in the centre of the park to then counter-press and stop the counter-attacks, it's left them very, very vulnerable. So against Southampton, it was a great example. Late, there was a counter-attack where Southampton just completely compacted the centre of the pitch. Sheffield United were attacking. They invited Sheffield United inside with the ball. They played like an easy pass inside. Southampton won the ball centrally. Basham had already overlapped and it was kind of game over from there. They played forward into the space. So, their kind of biggest strength or most interesting attacking feature last season has been their downfall at times this season. So I would say they're conceding from counter-attacks, personnel at the back and in midfield, and goalkeeper as being maybe the trio of reasons for their downfall this season.
And the interesting thing, analysing all this for me is the team last season and seasons before that as well in the Championship and lower down, they were always based on little opportunities but of high quality chances. So they'd give their opponents not very many high quality chances, but they themselves would also not create many high quality they would only create high quality chances but little and often. And so this is kind of reflected in their attacking data coming up into the Premier League. There was this over reliance on Sharp and McGoldrick to score the goals. Between the two of them, they had 38 goals of the 78 in that promotion season. And the thing is that it's never really been rectified, this over-reliance on them. The problem has been that there's been nobody to kind of rely on. Burke, Musset, McGoldrick, McBurney, Sharp. It's kind of a constant trial to have somebody up there. There's no kind of set individual that they look forward to. None of them have been a really reliable source of goals. Probably the best amongst them was Lys Mousset, but he struggled with fitness. So the team have struggled with that. And then looking at it this season, the little chances that they did have, last season, they're not even putting away as often this season. So the kind of thing that made them a bit stronger last season, their defence has gone away. Their attacking ability has gone away quite a bit as well. On both ends of the pitch, they've really fallen apart, and this has been a big problem. And maybe kind of analysing the attacking numbers, there's been, I think the most worrying for me is the reduction in kind of XG to goal conversion rate. So last season they were getting 1.02 goals per 90, which wasn't great. It was 16th, and that was from an XG of 1.15, 17th best in the Premier League. But then you look at the fact that they only had 0.55 goals per 90 this season, which is rock bottom, and that's from an XG of 0.92, which is 17th. Their ability to convert has almost halved. It's ridiculous. It's scary. So what kind of explanation is there, Tristan? Is that just from a lack of a lack of certainty of who's going to be attacking each week in terms of the forward personnel, or is it because of this inability? Because it just seems like the numbers point to an inability to get them into the back of the net, or are these chances that they're creating not good enough?
Yeah, so there's a multitude of reasons. One would be obviously luck, I think, plays a part slightly. But then if you look at the expected goals model itself, a lot of XG models don't fully appreciate the amount of defensive bodies or position of defensive bodies and goalkeeper in relation to the shot and the ball, which is kind of a reason why I think Brighton, for example, have massively underperformed expected goals, as we mentioned a few weeks ago. Okay, yes, their finishing has been poor, but also a lot of their shots, they're taken when there's 3 or 4 players in front of the ball, in front of the goal as well, and there's 8 or 9 players inside the box. And for the reasons I already mentioned, that Sheffield United's the teams that are facing them are compact in the central area, and because they're very wary of the 2 strikers and they're very wary of the crossing attack. They're putting as many defensive numbers in the box as possible. A lot of Sheffield United's shots and opportunities are from a crowded box. I go back to the Wolves game, for example. A lot of their shots were in that kind of scenario, and obviously it goes down to a bit of that, and then also quality as well. Ryan Brewster and Billy Sharp, 2 forwards that have played a lot for them this season, Burnley as well. I haven't seen anything in the data or through watching games to kind of make an argument for any of those 3 players being Premier League quality at all at any stage of their careers, to be quite honest. There's very, very little for me, so that kind of points to them being reliable forwards to get into goal scoring chances and then to also finish those chances. So recruitment has played a massive issue. And if you look at like Brewster's numbers, for example, they're absolutely kind of appalling for a forward, which, it comes down to the system slightly. And Brewster's a very young player still, might still go on to have a very good career as a Premier League player. But, they've really kind of missed someone up there that can finish the chances that they are creating.
And the interesting thing for me, though, is that Sheffield United, as I said there, they do have not very many chances, but they are of high quality. Last season, they had the 5th best big chances per 90, and that has gone down to 12th best. So it is showing that they are getting some high quality chances. They're not just putting it away. I think another thing that maybe you may have noticed is that last season, 80% of the team's attacks were coming down from both wings, and that was fairly well shared. But now this season, it is a little bit more through the middle, but mainly down the right. Does that mean that it has been easier to kind of thwart the attack of Sheffield United because, the defending team is going to know that it's all coming down the right-hand side and can just kind of block that off?
I think absolutely the predictability, as I've mentioned, of their attack, very wing-based, very crossing-based, using the overlapping centre-backs and not many other weapons, really. like that they brought in Sander Berger, who's been an okay player in the Premier League, but then they've got McGoldrick in the number 10 kind of withdrawn striker position, who I think is a very creative player, but again maybe not quite up to the standard of a top Premier League player. But honestly, I think he's one of their better players, like someone that can create something. But then aside from him, I can't really think of anyone who then for them that can get in between the lines, can play within the block, and provide something a bit different, and create something out of nothing that is very, very predictable. Like, as you said, mostly down the right side, and yeah, there's not that much variance there for opposition teams to worry about at all.
And part of this problem in attack, midfield, defence has been an inability to almost get back up for the team. The players that you mentioned there, Ampadu, who's been brought in, Brewster, and a lot of other individuals just haven't been good enough or been injured. So would you say that there's been poor signings from Wilder there, and maybe that's the kind of worst part about his Sheffield United time in the Premier League?
Yeah, exactly. It's not. I'm not sure who is making the signings in the club. I know part of Wilder's complaints and his kind of mutual departure from the club was down to the recruitment and him not thinking that they went hard enough in the transfer market, which is actually something that I kind of pointed out at the start of this season, that their players, their squad just wasn't good enough at all, despite an okay season last season. So yeah, definitely the recruitment has been poor. If you look at Ollie Watkins, for example, the striker that went from the Championship with Brentford to the Premier League with Aston Villa, I wouldn't say he's kind of set the Premier League alight as of yet. However, his numbers in terms of expected goals and assists, and it's been someone that Villa can rely on in that number 9 position. And Sheffield United have been crying out for someone like that. So yeah, the recruitment has been poor. As I mentioned, they've not hit the nail on the head with any of their signings, really. So yeah, really kind of disappointing season all round, and a kind of sum of lots of different parts, resulting in a relegation to the Championship.
And this is the interesting thing for me, is that maybe asking you here, Tristan, does it seem to you like Sheffield United were almost too reliant on a more traditional system of scouting players and going with what a manager likes rather than looking at data? Because you look at somebody like Brighton, they got Sanchez between the sticks, who's done a fantastic job in goal. Then you look at, maybe as you mentioned there, Ollie Watkins of Aston Villa, and he's got great numbers behind him, maybe not necessarily doing amazing bits every weekend, but he's also shooting enough, scoring enough for his data, and also creating opportunities with his running, which is maybe what Sheffield United needed. So with comparative levels of spending to a lot of teams in the Premier League, Sheffield United have not had a lot of bang for their buck. So is it right to kind of say it's inefficient of the club, and that is a big criticism of whoever made those signings?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely familiar with the way that they run the club. I know that they've got kind of a business partnership that owns the club. They own a club in Belgium as well. A couple of other clubs, maybe in the Middle East. It's like Saudi owners, I believe. So I'm not sure how they're going about recruitment with that kind of modern way of having lots of clubs interconnected, like City have, for example, like the Red Bull franchise. You'd expect that there'd be like very forward thinking as well in terms of recruitment and analytics, but I guess maybe not. I mean, they brought in, as I said, Sander Berger, whose data was quite good from his previous clubs, and so maybe it was that signing where they used kind of analytical recruitment for. But then the problem was further down the line. They didn't think about. They thought, okay, this is a good player, but they didn't think about whether if he specifically fitted into the team and the culture of the team and his position, and whether he replaced the kind of things that the other centre mids did, or he really added something that would help the team. So yeah, I'm not sure whether it's a lack of analytics in recruitment, or it's a problem with the way the players have settled and come into the squad, or it's a problem with the coaching, that maybe Brewster and McBurney don't get on with Wilder and Alan Neil, his assistant, and don't kind of respect that way of working, which maybe is a tiny bit outdated compared to the coaches that are working in the academies that Brewster would have played under, for example. So yeah, I don't know. It's I guess without being inside the club, it's difficult to hazard a guess at how well or badly they're run. But like going back to the main point is their signings have been nowhere near good enough.
So let's turn our attentions to maybe one other discussion point. And I've looked at the data here. Defensively, there was a huge drop-off in Project Restart. So maybe one of the things that we do have to talk about is COVID affecting the team. But that shouldn't be an excuse, because every team in the Premier League was affected by COVID. Every team kind of had that disrupted season, game week 30 onwards to game week 38, that 8-game week period. It was very disruptive. It did cause a few problems, but it was a level playing field on many aspects. So there's a few points that I wanted to put to you, and if you agree or if you think there were other reasons why from game week 30 to 38 there was this drop-off in defensive performances of Sheffield United, and that's why they ended up ninth when maybe they might have made that European position. So first of all, and it's a great phrase that Ben likes to use, is they're already playing in flip-flops. They thought, we're safe now, we've done the job that we need to do this season, we're in the Premier League, we will be next season. Europe, nice idea, but realistically we can just look forward to next season and build from there. There's also that element that you said and we've kind of looked at in terms of huge overperformance, and so there was just a natural regression. It was bound to happen. And then there was also a third aspect that I'd like you to quickly talk on, is the mental and physical fatigue, caught up with them after their first season in top flight. A lot of players, a lot of clubs struggle with that adaptation from the Championship to the Premier League. And so maybe just at that point, with COVID thrown in there, and maybe Wilder pushing or demanding a little bit too much from his players, it went the other way, and the players were just kind of so fatigued that they couldn't keep up anymore, and had done a fantastic job. They got ninth in their first season on a feather-bare squad. So what do you think of those three talking points to maybe come towards the end of discussions here?
Yeah, I think, as you said, they were kind of maybe riding a wave coming into the Premier League and doing so well, and they had so much momentum, and momentum is key in football. It's very kind of difficult to stop if your team's winning and winning every week and putting in great performances against some of the biggest clubs in the country. So yeah, that was massive for them. Also, like mentally, after a sustained period of success, and then you lose one or two games, like Chris Wilder and his kind of high standards that I said that he was setting, in at least in the press, kind of might have rubbed the players up the wrong way slightly. So they had a couple of defeats, and Wilder's been very successful at Northampton, at Sheffield United, at Oxford United. So that he maybe didn't know how to kind of deal with this kind of adversity and did it the wrong way. And there was kind of a big, lots of disagreements within the dressing room and things like this that caused them to go on their very, very poor run. Conditioning as well is something that you'd have to look at, where they maybe have slightly worse infrastructure and facilities and staff compared to teams that are more established in the Premier League and would have had that money through a number of seasons to kind of build very, very good levels of knowledge and facilities in terms of sports conditioning and fitness and the medical side of things, where the teams had so long off and then had to kind of return to play after like 3 weeks of training. That was a big kind of task for the players. So after so long off, you'd expect, like normally you'd have a pre-season of maybe 8 to 10 weeks before you start playing. They had half that time or even less. So maybe slight kind of physical factors stopping them from being able to perform in a lot of those games after the lockdown, the first lockdown periods. They seemed just to be physically far behind other teams they're playing against, Man United being one example. So it's kind of a multitude of factors and issues, and you can see the fitness as well, maybe coming on into this season when they've had key players injured. So yeah, it was kind of very, very strange how they were riding a wave and they were doing fantastically well, and then they started to have much poorer performances, but then at the same time, their numbers regressed to the mean slightly, a bit more as well. So that kind of emotional and mental thing from overperforming and thinking you're brilliant to kind of going where your performances are in terms of numbers, and then it's a mental complete switch, and then Wilder's personality in the dressing room maybe affected that as well. So yeah, kind of very, very interesting thing, how it completely dropped off after the first lockdown.
Yeah, and just on a final point here, reviewing the injury data here, because obviously this is Premier Injuries and we give the best Premier League injury analysis. And I got Ben to kind of look at some of the data that we do keep here, and his comments on it were that Sheffield United actually had the biggest difference between this season and last season was the incident rate. So Sheffield United went from one of the best one of the best injury records in 2019-20 to around mid-table. But the problem with that was these injuries were to key players in key positions in a side that didn't have a lot of squad depth. And so his reasoning was that luck was probably a big part of this. Muscle injuries were fairly low, meaning that it wasn't necessarily controllable, that a lot of these were just accidents and situations where they weren't necessarily overplayed and kind of more fault at the medical staff, even though it's not always that as well. So maybe as well, kind of bringing back in that psychological effect there, you can push the players for that one initial starting season in the Premier League, but that can only go so far. You can only run through an injury for so long before it catches up with you. And it has caught up with Sheffield United. I'll be sorry to see them leave the Premier League. And I'm sorry that this is the end of this week's Tactic Thursday. But you'll be back again soon, Tristan. Maybe next week, maybe the week after. You're an elusive, mysterious character in the the world of data analysis. But yeah, it's time to end. As I say, as always, remember to like, share and subscribe. But as always, it is a pleasure to talk to you, Tristan. Thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, mate, as always. Cheers. Enjoy the rest of your week.